Hello, and welcome to the next of our summaries of our discussion of the United Methodist social principles that we had here at Davison United Methodist Church. I'm Pastor Rob McPherson, and I'm glad that you've joined us today. So, today we talked about the section that begins on page 10 that talks about the stewardship of creation. And to begin our time, I had us look at a couple of different definitions of stewardship. What does it mean to say that we are stewards of something? Two of the definitions, one came from a dictionary: the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. And then one from a more Bible-based dictionary: the responsible use of God-given resources. And of course, someone noticed right away that the word that is in both of those definitions is responsible. And both suggest that we've been given something or entrusted with something to care for in that responsible way. The openings to the section of stewardship of creation says in Genesis 1, we read that God declares creation good. And then it talks about each of the days, after every day of creation, God calls creation good. And we read in Genesis 2 that God took the human and settled him in the Garden of Eden to farm it and to take care of it. So the goodness of God's creation and the value given to every part of it call people to respect, protect, and care for the creation and all interrelated aspects of it. I then ask, are there other scriptures that come to mind when we talk about stewardship of creation, that talk about how we need to be caring for that which God has given us? And several of the passages that came to mind actually are not necessarily about creation itself, but they are about stewardship of things that God has given us. So one that came to someone's mind was the idea of the tithe, that we are to take 10% of anything we've grown or that we have earned, and that goes to support, in the Old Testament, it goes to support the Levites. That group of people who are the priests and the overseers of the law. I mentioned the parable of the talents, where Jesus talks about a manager who gives. It depends on which version of the parable you read, whether it's the one from Matthew or from Luke, but in one, the manager gives 10 talents to one of the servants, 5 to another, and 1 to the last, and they each have to be responsible with that. And one of the servants comes back and has doubled it, another servant's come back and has doubled it, and the third servant has just buried it in the ground. And talking about what do we do to care for the resources that God has given us. Another person mentioned that the land is given rest. It's supposed to be rotated and not used, so every so many years the land is supposed to be given a rest. And in fact, taking that another step, there's this concept in the Bible of a Jubilee year, which happens about every 50 years, in which the land is to be given rest, in which debts are to be forgiven and slaves are to be set free. And so that there is this sense of responsibility and care for the land again. But it also goes into economics. The Jubilee concept is a really big one and covers a lot of areas of what we talk about with our social principles. But it certainly reflects on our stewardship of creation here, as it again talks about the land being given a rest. So then we moved from discussion just basically of stewardship to the first one, which is environmental racism. And we began by reading the section and defining what environmental racism is. So clearly from the statement, environmental racism is the idea that we give bad land to those that are of different ethnicities or religions or poorer than other groups, or we exploit the areas that people who are poorer or of other races live in, and then those individuals don't benefit from the loss of resources, or we place toxic waste dumps or hazardous materials or pollution in areas where those who are richer don't have to see them. All of those types of behaviors are environmental racism. They're basically practices that suggest that some people, their land can be abused, and others it doesn't have to be. I'm trying to remember, one of our members summed it up really well, basically saying, everything I don't want goes over there. You get it. All the bad stuff, and I get all the good stuff. Pretty simple summary of it, but yeah, that's basically what environmental racism is that I can treat the land you're on differently than the land that I am on. So moving from talking about that, we did then talk about this statement says very clearly a couple of times that one of the solutions to that is self-determination, listening to people who live in the areas, and not only that, allowing, I'm going to read the quote, self-determination entails, among other things, access to all pertinent information and significant decision-making power over industrial, agricultural, and other developments that have potential to wreak significant harm on the land, air, and water. In other words, allowing people to have the information they need and the power to make decisions about what happens with the land that they live on, which is part of, I mean, that's a big part of the solution to environmental racism, is allowing people the ability to, the education to make decisions that are for their own best. So then I asked if any of us had not really necessarily experienced it, but had witnessed it. And that was pretty clearly right away, the Flint water crisis was named. And also the placement of freeways was also talked about, as how often freeways are run through land of people who don't have, well, it's run through people of neighborhoods of different races, or people that don't have the money to say no. But the Flint water crisis was a great example of environmental racism. It certainly is saying, we're not going to care for the water, we're not going to care for the infrastructure that is necessary to provide you or provide this group of people with an equally healthy standard of water. It was a great example, amazingly one I hadn't thought of, and I'm glad people came to that one so quickly, because it is truly an example of it. So we talked about then, why should we resist that? And clearly the reasons are, again, come back to, we believe that all people are children of God. All people bear that image of God. And so everyone deserves to have the equal ability to thrive and survive in the land that they live on. This statement calls us then to resist practices and policies that cause environmental racism, and to allow people to make determinations for themselves. The second section was sustainable policies and practices. Ask us to talk about what were some unsustainable things that we do. I was thinking maybe we'd talk about some lighter things, but we went into all kinds of things. Plastics was a pretty big discussion, as not being sustainable, as continuing to cause harm, and just a number of things that people confessed were probably not sustainable and that we needed to think about in other ways. Water use was another one that people mentioned pretty frequently. knowing that their habits of water use were probably not sustainable and that we needed to think about how to do that differently. Biblically and theologically, why should we care about sustainability? And really, sustainability ultimately comes down to caring for things so that the next generation has them. The statement here says, sustainable policies and practices aim to meet present human need while ensuring that future generations have the resources that they need to thrive. So it is about the next generation. And that gives us a place where we can look at some things biblically. There are some passages in the Bible that talk about us preserving things for the next generation or teaching things to the next generation, knowing that we're passing on that legacy of faithfulness to the next generation. And of course, it's caring for our kids, but for those that were in the group that they themselves didn't have kids, it was also understanding that we're passing that on not only to our kids, but to the people around us and their kids and that next generation. And we know that that's an important thing, just from a human perspective, let alone from a Christian perspective. Food justice. Food justice was a great conversation. So food justice, this section talks about a couple of things which we had to identify and understand, define. First one is food justice itself, and that's the idea that everyone should have access to food, healthy food, clean food, also food that is culturally appropriate. We then talked about food sovereignty, which is a slightly different. So had people talk about what is sovereignty. There was a little bit of pause. We had to think about it. But sovereignty is that ability to decide for yourself, to make your own decisions. So the right that people have to choose what they eat, what they produce, what they grow, and that idea that people should be able to grow and eat the foods that they want to, that are right for their area, that work in the land that they have, and not be told that they're going to grow rubber trees when they can't eat rubber trees. So this whole idea of sovereignty is being able to make decisions for yourself. We talked about Heifer Project, which we support, which allows families to raise animals and gives them animals to begin with, is a form of food sovereignty. It is, and food justice, because it allows people to raise animals and to care for them, and then to use either the animal products or the animals themselves for food. A big section of this talks about patenting of seed varieties, which was an interesting section in this. The rapidly expanding practice of patenting seed varieties and charging farmers for their use has reduced access to traditional crops and increased indebtedness of subsistence and smaller scale farms. So we support, the statement says, open source efforts. So I had to have people do a little bit of work here. So what is, why is patenting seeds a problem? And of course we talked about that really restricts then who can use the seed. It means that you can't just continue to grow. Even if you take seed from that patented seed the next year, even if you save a portion of your crop, you can't use it because it's patented, so you have to pay again to the company for the rights to use that particular seed. And that becomes, of course, the word that was used was greed. And then what does it mean to be open source or cooperatively developing seed? And that would be in a situation where people develop the seed as a group and allow everyone within the group to use it. So One person may be crossbreeding a couple of types of corn, and another person has also input into that, and then all together we take this corn that's been developed and all are able to use it. Uh, it Open source is often used in software where a program is begun and others make changes to it, and eventually you have this program that everyone's allowed to use, and it's been developed by many people. The same idea with food and seed is that we're developing things together that can be used by anyone and all. Let's see, what else did we talk about? We talked. I mean, one of the clear things is food is talked about a lot in the Bible. There are a ton of passages that talk about the use of food. Everything from, we talked about Jubilee, but there's also the sense of gleaning. So where those who grew crops were not to harvest the entire thing, but to leave an area for widows and orphans and the poor to come and pick the crops themselves. We talked about I have seen some fruit farmers that do that. Soybeans, that doesn't make much sense. I'm not so sure about people coming to pick their own soybeans. One of our members talked about having seen a pepper farm that used to do that allowed the public to come in and glean after they had picked, but then they discovered that they liked having those extra peppers themselves, and so they started hiring people to glean it and pick it for them, and no longer allowed the public to come in and do that. There's just a ton of biblical examples of how food should be distributed justly, allowing ways for the poor to have access to food. It's a huge, huge topic in the Bible. Just so many times where it talks about care for the widows and the orphans and their food, their access to food. It even talks about carbon footprint here in terms of food, and one was talking about how there are places where we can see what the carbon footprint of our food is, and some food has a low footprint, some has a medium, some has a high footprint. For example, beef generally has a pretty high carbon footprint. It requires a lot in order for us to have a little. But we'll get to that here in just a moment when we get to caring for all creatures. So this was perhaps the one we had a bit of discussion on and difference of, but we also had some fun with it, and I think we were trying to be respectful for each other, and that was in caring for all creatures. We all agreed on the need for respectful and humane treatment of animals. We've all had animals, whether pets of various types or horses or cattle. Understanding that those creatures are wonderful, they have their personalities, and we grow to love them, and they're an important part of our lives, and so wanting to treat them humanely. We all were on an agreement in that, very much so. The next section of that statement talks about how they're used in agriculture and labor, and certainly, we in the United States, not many of us, perhaps the Amish use the animals in their farming, but we do know that in a lot of places in the world, animals are still an important part of the agricultural production process, whether that's water buffalo or oxen or horses. And this talks about their need for rest biblically. The Sabbath applies to animals as well, and so the animals are supposed to be given rest as well. And then we get to the fun one, and that was animals raised for human consumption that should be provided with healthy living conditions, sufficient food and water, reared in humane conditions and slaughtered in a manner that minimizes their overall suffering and pain. And of course, we get into the difference between those who are vegetarians and those that aren't. So one immediately, when I ask I asked, what do you think about human consumption of animals? And someone said, I want bacon. And then another person said, well, I'm a vegetarian. And we did that. I think we were respectful in our conversation, understanding that some people really do care about animals in a way that it is against their principles to eat animals, but others want to be able to have access to the meat. And but they also did care about if the animals were treated in a humane way, wanting them to be able to have a quality of life at least, and to not, when they're slaughtered, to be able to not be put through any undue stress or pain, but to have that done as humanely as possible. I did talk about how there is a long-standing practice of how animals should be slaughtered in the Jewish tradition, the kosher food laws, and also within the Islamic tradition. There's several places where in the Bible where it talks about how animals should be killed and where. Also got into the biblical vegetarianism. There are actually some passages that recommend vegetarianism at various places, but there are also passages that allow humans to eat meat. So there's kind of this both and there. There's a place in Genesis where through a certain point in time, humans only ate plants, and then God gives them the ability to eat animals. But at the same time, we run into Daniel, who was a vegetarian, and it's because of his vegetarianism that he is considered stronger and healthier. And there's sort of this recommendation unwritten beneath that that vegetarianism is healthier, at least for him and for those of the Israelites at the time, and that was what differentiated them from other people. So it's interesting that there's this sort of both and going on here about talking about vegetarians and but also this willingness for us to be allowed to eat meat. So of course we differ from each other. Some want their hamburger, some do not. We did talk about within this the concepts of doing no harm and doing good as best we can within whatever form of belief we have about consumption of meat. What does it mean to do no harm? What does it mean to do good as we are caring for those animals along the way? So it was in many ways it was a fun conversation and good along the way. So I haven't caught everything that we talked about, but that's a majority of what we talked about. When we came to our ending, I asked if there were any final words of wisdom, and one of our members talked about food waste, about restaurants and how much food gets thrown away there. I mentioned, not only in restaurants, but also in our homes. Food waste is an interesting one. It was interesting that we didn't really talk about that, but it is an issue where we use food and almost disposably, with a disposable attitude, where we throw away a lot of food. Restaurants do, companies do. We talked about the dating of foods where it's best if sold by, but it's still good for sometimes years after that date, but it's thrown away. How that can still be used in food pantries and other places, and we can use it on our shelves. That food's still good. Doesn't need to be thrown away. It was a good topic that wasn't among what we talked about earlier in the process with the food justice, with sustainability, but yet goes into that of how do we make sure that the food that we have is being used and wisely and that we're not wasting it. So again, lots of good conversation, good topics about stewardship, of how we manage and care for the environment and the world around us, how we care for food and what we do with it. And thank you for joining me in this sort of wrap up of our conversations of the day. And again, I pray that God would bless you and keep you and surround you until we're able to meet again. Have a wonderful and blessed day.